Back in 2015, I was working as a live-in home health aide for a wealthy family. It was just me and my patient living in a very nice condo in a quiet neighborhood on a golf course. We were the youngest people who lived there. I was 27 at the time, and my patient was a 21-year-old male with Asperger's, SPD, and BPD, and substance abuse problems. He had recently gotten into some trouble and been legally declared incompetent. Jake was his name. He was a nice kid but had severe emotional issues and almost no social awareness, compounded by the refusal to take prescribed medication, which worked incredibly well when he took it, and drug abuse. He was taken advantage of a lot because of the crowd that he hung around with. Right before I moved in, 6 friends came to hang out with Jake one day and ended up staying for 2 weeks, draining Jake's bank account on various drugs and absolutely trashing the condo. Jake was lonely and never said no to people. He wanted them to like him. Honestly, I think Jake was 14 to 15 years old mentally. I think he turned to drugs to deal with depression and anxiety, and also to fit in with the people around him. He's much better now. It was a sweet gig. I was paid very well, lived in a nice condo rent-free, and basically just had to keep our house clean, keep food in the fridge, and make sure he took his meds. When I moved in, my boss, Jake's mother, warned me about a girl who occasionally stayed with her father, who was our downstairs neighbor. She told me that the girl was named Amber, and she looked younger, but she was 37 years old, tall, blonde, and very thin. She was right. She did look much younger, about 25-ish. She said Amber didn't have a car or a job, and she was an addict who liked to use Jake. Amber's father had custody of her 2 children, and she would come to visit the kids and stay for a few days a week. She said one day Amber asked to borrow Jake's car for an hour, and ended up running off with it for 2 weeks. Amber was also the one who introduced Jake to the 6 friends who trashed the condo. She was bad news, and never allowed in the condo. She wanted me to call her immediately if Amber stopped by or Jake went anywhere with her. After the theft, she put a GPS on Jake's car and allegedly she could stop the engine. My boss made it clear that she didn't expect me to be a security guard, just notify her of things that were going on. Leading up to this event, I had a few run-ins with this Amber, where I had to politely tell her that she wasn't allowed to come into the apartment. Jake could not take her to the store or anywhere, and no, Jake couldn't go to a party at her boyfriend's house. Amber was always spaced out, like she spoke really slow, seemed wide-eyed and off. She explained to me that she had been hit by a car while riding a bike recently, and complained that she was the one who ended up going to jail. I was like, how? Apparently she takes a lot of Xanax and was under the influence, so I think that explains the spaced out part. She never sounded aggressive, but it was clear that she didn't like me, and would often say things like, Jake is his own person. He's a 21-year-old man, he doesn't need permission. And whenever she spoke to Jake, when we saw her at the gym or the parking lot, she would be whispering to him, no doubt trying to manipulate him into giving her money or something. Anyway, on to the incident. Jake was out of state with his father, giving me a mini vacation. My best friend was staying over to spend a few days with me, and we were drinking PBR and watching RuPaul's Drag Race. It's about 11 p.m, and we hear a light knock on the door. I go to investigate through the peephole and see it's Amber. I ignore her. She locks louder about 30 seconds later, and I watched her leave through the peephole and sit back down, telling my friend the situation. 5 minutes go by and she's back. This time she's pounding on the door like a cop. I'm getting pissed because I'm off work, and I don't want to deal with her crazy, especially when my friend is over. So I say nothing and go back to the couch, She starts knocking like a normal person and starts saying, "Hello, Jake, I need help." I carry on ignoring her. Then I hear her try to open the door, but it's locked. And this enrages her or something, and she starts screaming and pounding on the door non-stop. I get up and look through the peephole again, and she looks like a demon. Her pupils were huge, so I think she was on something. She looked crazed. Her hair was tangled and wild. She was sweaty and angry. Looking back, I'll never forget those wide pupils looking at me through an evil glare. I ask her through the door what she wants, and she said that she needs to speak with Jake right now, that he owes her money, and she needs to ride to her boyfriend's right now. I tell her Jake isn't home. She then asks me if I will take her, to which I say no. I've been drinking and that I'm going to bed. She let out some frustrated scream, punched the door and left. My friend and I went to bed shortly after, and didn't hear from her again. The next morning, we're getting ready to leave to go have breakfast. I hear a knock, like policemen knocking at the door. You know the sound. I look through the peephole expecting to see Amber, but this time it's an actual cop. I open the door and can see my parking lot is full of police. There's a van marked crime scene unit and an ambulance. I honestly assumed Amber overdosed or something. The cop wanted to ask me if I heard anything strange last night. I tell him about my encounter with Amber and ask if she's okay. He tells me that she is in custody for the murder of her father. Does Jake own a crossbow and is missing one? Yes, and yes. It's been missing for weeks. He says I need to speak to some detectives at the station. So I don't know if she came to my door before or after it happened, with a crossbow like she's Tyrion Lannister or something. But the detective told me that his theory was that she was a heroin addict, and she was withdrawing and needed to get to her boyfriend's for some more dope. She tried to get Jake to drive her, and when that didn't work, she asked her father, who refused. Then, this is what went down. They argued. Our neighbors heard that. She ended him with the stolen crossbow and stole his truck. She only got a mile away before she was signaled by 2 cops. She led the cops on a high-speed chase over the span of 2 counties before she finally lost control and crashed. The cops were only pulling her over on suspicion of drink driving, but when they went to speak to her, she told them that she was speeding because she needed to check on her dad. She thought that someone had ended him. They asked her why she thought that, and she couldn't answer. They sent police for a welfare check, and they found him before her sons did. So, that was the time my crazy, drug-addicted neighbor ended her father's life with my patient's crossbow. Please, let's never meet again. This happened 2 summers ago, while I was house-sitting out in California for an older couple I had met at a conference for work. It had seemed like a dream scenario. The couple wanted to vacation in Hawaii for 2 weeks, but didn't want to board their cats, and I had been chatting with them about wanting to visit California again, where they happened to live. Because I had loved it the first time I went, and we figured that we could mutually benefit if I came out and house sat for them. That's what we agreed to. I flew out there, and they showed me around for a few days, taught me how to care for the cats, 2 of them. One was extremely shy and I barely saw, which is important later, and their plants, as well as give me access to their house and cars. These people were very generous, and before I knew it, I had dropped them off at the airport and I was on my own. At first, it really was the dream vacation. I was staying in Oakland and making forays into San Fran, Sonoma, and Monterey. In the mornings, I would walk out the front door and shortly be hiking the paths surrounding nearby Mount Diablo, and I was just ultra content with the world. I was so enamored by the area that I had actually started looking into taking some steps to relocate out there. But then one day, about halfway through my final week, when I got back to the house, I felt really odd, almost like I shouldn't go inside. I shook it off and went inside anyway, because it was getting late and I needed to put out dinner for the cats. Once I was inside, I forced myself to ignore how off it felt, and I made some food for myself and went to bed. I was shocked to find this shy cat hiding under my bed and crying. This was the first time I had ever seen her up close. The entire time I had been there, up to that point, she never left the host's bedroom unless she didn't realize I was around. Again, I ignored feeling weird and just assumed she had decided I was okay and went to bed. I did start locking my bedroom door that night though. I also remember that about halfway through that night, I thought I heard someone walking around in the gravel outside my road, but after listening for a bit, I didn't hear anything else and went back to sleep. The day after in the morning, I still felt a little odd, but kept up with my plans for the day. I drove out to a little music festival in Sonoma and went clothes shopping and had a great overall day. When I get back to the house though, I found the front door locked in a way I hadn't left it. Basically, my host never locked the deadbolt, only the lower second lock. And that's the only lock my key worked on. So I never messed with the deadbolt, but it was definitely locked. So I had to call my host and find the hideaway key, which to their credit, safety-wise, was buried like a whole foot underneath a bush outside and had definitely not been unearthed for a long time. So I used that. I went inside and kept the key with me just in case it happened again. And it did, but for a different door. This time I had stepped out into the garage to get a drink, and when I turned around to go back into the house, the door was shut and locked. I could use my normal key on that door, but I was still pretty bewildered. My own cat's a wag, so I think in my mind I was trying to come up with a way the cats could be locking me out the house, but I was coming up empty. I decided I must have been misunderstanding how the locks worked, and just wrote it off and started checking and triple checking the locks when I went out the house or into the garage. That night, when I went to bed, there was a really awful feeling of unease that was still there, and so was the shy cat, who was clearly unhappy to see me but also wouldn't leave my room. But again, I just locked my bedroom door and went to sleep. The next morning I felt awful, nausea, body ache, and I had no desire to leave the house, so I decided to stay in and Netflix for the day. This vacation stay was like a full 2 weeks, so I didn't feel like I was in any hurry to get all my touristy things in. Anyway, as the day went on, I started to feel that feeling of wrongness again, and it morphed into the feeling of being watched. Around mid-afternoon, it got to the point that I was so uneasy that, even feeling awful, I decided to get out of the house for a bit to shake it off. I was getting a bit low on food, so I went to the grocery store and bought a few items that I didn't think would hurt my stomach, and I started to leave the checkout, and the cashier said the generic, "Have a great evening," and I just instantly started crying, shocking myself and the poor cashier, because I just had this intrusive thought that said, "You might be the last person to ever say that to me." When I got to my car, I was still crying, and my entire body was telling me not to drive back to the house. I couldn't not though, because I didn't want to neglect the cats. So I drove back, parked in the driveway, and convinced myself after about half an hour to just open the front door. Once I did that, I thought I would get over it and be able to go in and at least feed the cats, and then maybe I'd get a hotel room after. But my body physically would not let me inside. It was like I was stuck in the entryway, and I then made a deal with myself. I would yell into the house, saying I had already called the police and that they were on their way. In panic logic, I figured that that would make anyone in the house leave. So I faced the inside of the house, looking down the hallway towards the bedrooms, and I did just that. The second I had finished saying, "They're almost here, so if you want to avoid being arrested, you better leave now," the light in my host's room turned on and I heard some banging. Immediately I hightailed it back to the car, called the police for real, and proceeded to have a mental breakdown while talking to the dispatcher. Once they arrived, they checked the house and didn't find anyone. The double doors in my host's bedroom were left wide open. I'm so glad the cats didn't get out. And there was a pile of food wrappers in the corner behind the blinds, so they said it looked like someone had been there. What makes it so scary to me is that nothing was taken, and that based on the shape of the house, that would have been the perfect vantage point to see me in the living room as I stayed home sick. To explain this, the house was in an L shape, and from the windows into the garden that were in my host's bedroom, you could see into the living room windows. Also, the minute the police were gone, they said they couldn't prove anyone was there. There were no signs of forced entry, and we couldn't get a hold of my hosts immediately to verify if anything had been taken, which once they were back, they verified that nothing had been. So they said they'd do a patrol, but nothing else. The shy cat was right back in my host's bedroom, and I didn't see her again until I left to go back home. So basically, I think the intruder had been there at least 2 days, forcing her to choose between two strangers and leading her to choose the one that was at least a little less strange. It messed me up pretty bad, especially because they didn't catch the person and didn't seem to have any desire to look, and I still had to stay in that house for the next 3 days. Nothing else odd happened, and I didn't feel anything off the rest of the time I was there, but the damage was done. I've never felt completely safe in a home without doing a complete search before bed since. But I am extremely glad my gut spoke up. I guess I'd rather have some residual anxiety than not be here at all. So whoever was in my host's house watching me, please, let's never meet. I'm a 23-year-old female. I live in a townhouse with my 2 children of ages 2 and 6 months. My fiancé did live with us until 2 weeks ago, when I caught him with another woman and made him move out. That's important to the story. I'm a stay-at-home mum, and when he did live with us, my ex worked evenings. Let me set the scene. We live in a tiny house in northern Pennsylvania. My line of townhouses sits in front of a big field that runs in line with the woods. As far as I'm aware, these woods stretch for at least a few miles, and I'm not aware of any houses in the area or any roads that lead through them. My living room has 3 windows that look to the field, and my bedroom on the 2nd floor only has 1 window that faces that way as well. People do tend to walk their dogs back in the field, and kids sometimes play there, but I rarely ever see anyone close to my house. For that reason, I tend to leave my blinds and curtains open, partially because I just enjoy the view. July 2019, a year ago, I was laying in bed trying to fall asleep. All the lights were off, but I had my window and blinds open since it was warm. I was looking out the window, and I noticed small red and white lights just outside. I got up and looked to realize the lights were coming from a drone. I ran downstairs to where my fiancé of the time was sitting in the living room and ran to the window. I told him what I saw, but of course, when he went to look, it was gone. I was paranoid that the drone could have had a camera on it, and someone was watching me with it. I kept my blinds closed for a while after that. Fast forward to January of this year. I stupidly got comfortable and assumed that whoever it was flying the drone was a one-time creep. My blinds were open and I had just gotten out of the shower. I was sitting on my bed, pretty much in my birthday suit except for my underwear, scrolling on my phone, when out of the corner of my eye I saw lights again from the dark window. It was that drone again. I ran out of the room and waited for a few minutes. I peeked back into my room and it was gone. I quickly shut my blinds again and got dressed. Honestly, I felt sick at how stupid I was to leave my window open again, especially when I was practically undressed. Now for the really disturbing part. My 2-year-old son and I were out in the field 2 weeks ago, 3 days after I kicked out my boyfriend. We were playing ball. I had my 6-month-old strapped to me in a baby carrier. Probably about a half hour after we'd been out there, I heard a slight whirring noise coming towards us. I looked up and saw that damn drone flying towards us. I looked around and didn't see anyone. It stopped right over us. I freaked and grabbed my son and dragged him into the house, looking back at the tree line every so often as we went. I knew they had to be hiding in there. I went inside, closed the blinds, and called my mum and told her about the situation. She told me to just keep an eye out, and I said I would. My son likes to line up his toys along the windowsill, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to open them up just an inch or so. A little while later, after we ate dinner, it was almost dark. I was feeding my 6-month-old, and my son was playing. He was standing over by the window lining up his toys, and he started saying, "Dada, Dada." I assumed he was just missing his father, and dismissed him by saying he was going to see him that weekend. He kept saying, "Dada, Dada." I looked up and saw him pointing to the window, under the little gap the blinds didn't cover. I froze. I remember that he calls any man with facial hair Dada because it reminds him of his father. There was no way someone would be bold enough to actually come up to my window. Not when my neighbors are literally right there. Anyone could see them. But there aren't any lights back there. So unless someone actually stepped out their house, I guess no one would see them. Maybe it was my ex, but he should be at work at that time. I ran to the window and moved my son, and I didn't want to lift the blinds, but honestly, I was sure it had to be the person who'd been creeping on me for the past year, but I wanted to see who it was. I pushed the blinds up, and I was looking at a man that I had never seen before, crouching in front of me. He was bald with a moustache and goatee. I have no idea how old he was. He could have been anywhere from 30 to 50. When he saw me, he smiled and stood up. I yelled and told him to leave and that I was calling the cops. He just stood there, smiling at me like some freak. I was about to close the blinds again when he said something I couldn't hear. I told him to leave again, and he said it louder this time. "I just want to talk to you." I shook my head. "No." And he yelled the same thing over. He started slapping his hands on the window, yelling "no, no, no" over and over. I grabbed my phone, scared he was trying to break in, and dialed 911. My kids were crying from the yelling, and I was on the verge of tears. I told the operator what was going on. The whole time I was on the phone, the man was pounding on my window, screaming. He was yelling all kinds of nonsense, and I only caught some of it. He said he's been watching me for months, that I'm beautiful, and he wants me to come with him, and that he'll end the lives of the little ones if I didn't. The operator told me to go into an upstairs room and hide until the police arrive. My town doesn't have a police department, so we rely on the state police, and she said it would be about 20 minutes, but just to stay on the phone with her. The man was practically punching my window now, and was screaming like a maniac. I was about to grab my kids and run upstairs when I heard someone else screaming. The man bolted. I looked out and saw my neighbor and his girlfriend. I opened the window and my neighbor said that he heard the man, so he ran around the building. He said when the guy heard him, he ran back into the woods and disappeared into the tree line. They said they also had called the police. I thanked them 100 times, and the police got there 10 minutes later. They did a quick search around the buildings and in the trees, but obviously didn't find anything. I've been super paranoid since then, and stayed at my parents' a few nights after it happened. I don't know why that guy targeted me, or why he waited so long to do something. I'm just happy my neighbors were there to intervene, or who knows what would have happened. So to the creep who's been following me and my family for the last year, I genuinely hope we never meet again. This happened a few years ago when I was 13 and my brother was 11. My parents had to go out and thought it would be better to leave me and my brother home alone. So that's what they did, and they left, taking my sister aged 6 with them. Me and my brother were all the way down in our basement, which is where we had our video game set up, and the two of us were just downstairs playing Mario Kart on the Wii. We had the home phone in between us just in case one of our parents called, and an hour goes by and the phone starts to ring. We look down and the caller ID says it's our uncle. We decide to just let it ring, and how our phone worked, it would ring about 5 times and then stop. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3, and the phone stops ringing. My brother doesn't pay attention to it, but I do realize for it to stop that early is if someone were to pick it up, and we were home alone. I get really suspicious and my paranoia gets the better of me, and I take my brother and we go upstairs and see the phone is still there. But there is still a phone on the 3rd floor, and my parents' room, so we go towards the stairs, and what we see chilled us to the bone. A man in his late 40s to early 50s is all I can really tell you, because the second we saw him, me and my brother screamed, ran out the front and went straight to our neighbor's house. We tell them what happened and they proceeded to call the police, then our parents. They came fast. I don't know what was wrong with the man, but he never left the house. He just stood there, and from what I heard, after he was arrested he was placed in a mental hospital. The story may not be totally crazy compared to many others, but I just think what could have happened to me and my brother if my uncle didn't decide to call. For context, I am female. My parents got divorced when I was 10 and my brother was 8. They had bought a house in a fairly big plot of land and decided to split it. The house was demolished, and my mum was building a new house to live with me and my brother. We lived in a very small city that is known for its safety. Fast forward to when I was 15, and the house still wasn't ready. Me, my brother and my mum lived in an apartment really nearby to where they were building the house, so we would check in on it from time to time. It was an evening when me and my mum were getting back from the market and decided to check the house. As we were parking in front of the house, the car lights showed a man trying to jump the fence to get in. I was really freaked out, but my mum stepped out the car and shouted to the guy, asking what the hell he was trying to do. It was an old guy in his late 60s, really tall and skinny. He was starting to bald, having hair only on the sides of his head. He was giving really creepy vibes. He jumps out of the fence and looks scared. He wasn't expecting someone to show up because no one lived there yet. He said he lived in the apartment building next to the house and was trying to cut down a branch from a tree that was knocking on his window. So my mum said he was trespassing, and if he wanted to do something in her house, he should have contacted her. She yelled at him to go away and not return. We went home and never really spoke about it anymore. A few months later, my family finally moved into that house. It was a cute home with lots of trees and space for my dogs to roam free in. At the time we had 3 dogs, 2 small ones and a border collie that we rescued. Every day we could hear a teenager female voice yelling at the apartment building next to our house. We figured it was just some teenage drama, because we could always hear her saying the same things every teenager says to their parents. I don't want to live here. You don't get me at all. And so we never really did anything about it. Some time passed, and my best friend moved to an apartment in that building. She said she could hear them yelling to her father. Guess who the father was? The man that was trying to get into our yard. That freaked me out a little bit, but I didn't have any proof he was doing something to her. One evening I was eating some fruits in the front of my house with my dogs, and I heard someone scream, like a man and woman were fighting. I looked around and figured out it was coming from the building next to my house. As I looked to the building, I saw a woman falling from a balcony, but couldn't see if anyone had pushed her, so I called an ambulance, and they were really fast in getting her and taking her to the hospital. At the same time, the police came and took a man that I couldn't get a good look at to see if it was the same one that was trespassing. I don't know what happened that day and who the man was. My dad then started building his house next to my mum's. I spent a lot of time in my best friend's apartment that was just by the creep's apartment. As I said, my yard was full of trees, and sometimes I could see animals there like lizards, snakes, foxes and possums. One day me and my friend were in her balcony, and I could see a lizard walking on the wall that separated my house and the building. In the balcony next to hers, the creepy man showed up with a firearm trying to shoot the lizard. We began screaming at him, begging for him not to kill it. He looked as surprised as before. I guess he thought he was alone. He said nothing and went back to his apartment. I told my dad about it, and he just said we shouldn't interact with that man. I was already 18 at this point, and things started to calm down, or so I thought. It was an afternoon around 4, and I was home alone. I went for a walk with my border collie. She's really sweet, and I was used to riding my bike, and she'd always follow me. So that's what I did. As we were coming home back to my house, just passing by the building, that man throws a very large rock at my dog. She was running, so the rock hit her leg. I cursed him, went back to my house looking at my dog to see if she was hurt. I told my mum, and she said I should never walk alone. Sometime later, I found a really cute but skinny cat at my college. I was sitting down smoking and this cat jumped in my lap. I came back to watch a class with him in my lap, and he slept through the whole thing. I brought him home. He was orange and fierce, and he was a street cat. We let him go for walks in the street, and everyone liked him. He was really friendly and asked for pets from everyone. People let him in their houses and frequently sent my mum pics of the cat on their yard or sofa. So we never thought he was bothering anyone by walking around. At this time we were forgetting about the violent nature from our neighbor. My family went on a trip to visit my grandma, and my dad stayed to take care of our pets. He said one night he heard some footsteps around his house, but as he walked out the front door he couldn't see anyone. He thought it was just the dogs messing around and went back to his house to go to sleep. When we came back, we realized one of the trees back in my mum's house was dying. It was a really big tree, over 100 years old, one of the biggest in the yard, and was really beautiful. As you can imagine, this was the tree the man was complaining about before, the first time we met him. So my dad went to look at the tree and found out it had a lot of holes in it. He said it's a way to get poison inside the tree and kill it. He also said we shouldn't tell my mum because it was going to scare her and make her more upset, because the trees were the main reason she bought that place. I never told her about it. Some time goes by and me and my brother moved out to another town to finish our studies. I wanted to take the cat with me, but my mum said it was going to be hard for him to adapt to a new living environment. He liked so much being able to walk around, so I agreed that he could stay with her. A few days later, She visited me and told me that my cat had passed away. I was broken. How did it happen? She found him with his neck broken in front of the apartment building next to our house, his head twisted, but my cat was still alive. But as she arrived in the vet's, the cat passed. She said that she thinks it was the man that did that. We didn't have any proof, but you know the feeling when you just know? I cried so much. He was my first cat and so sweet. My mom still lives in that house. She has 5 cats now, but none of them go out, and the man is still her neighbor. I'm with her during quarantine, and I see him all the time, walking past our house, always looking up to see if someone's there. I later found out that the girl who fell from the balcony survived. She came back in a wheelchair, but I'm unsure if that was permanent or not. She took her things and went away. I don't know who pushed her, but my best friend that lived in the same building said the man was still living there. A few months after this, a lot of creepy things started to happen on our neighborhood. About turning him to the police, well, when he threw a rock at my dog, I did report him to the police, but nothing happened. I didn't contact the authorities about the other stuff, because I don't have any proof. Maybe we'll invest in cameras. This past Friday, I, a 27-year-old male, fell asleep around 8 p.m. after work. When I woke up around 9, I decided it was too late to go out, so I made a plan to run to the gym down the street instead for a late-night workout. The small all-men's gym is just about a mile down the road. It was empty and dark inside, but the owner had given me a door code to get in. However, for whatever reason, the code wasn't working, and I could not get to the gym. I wanted to work out, so I decided I would just extend my run and head up to the local middle school playground and do some pull-ups on the monkey bars instead. I figured it was better than no workout at all. I got to the block that the middle school was on and began walking down towards the playground. On the way, I passed 2 young girls walking in the opposite direction. I would guess they looked about 11 or 12. They were silent and looked at me nervously as we passed. Understandable, as I'm a reasonably large man standing at 6'4" at almost 10 p.m. on an empty street at night. I live in a little suburban town of about 12,000 people, with little crime. It's a dry town with mostly larger residential homes. The town is only 2 miles across and is very safe, has a family feel, and most of the residents are upper-class families that take advantage of the great school system. Despite the reputation of safety the town has, I thought it was much too late and dark for these 2 young girls to be wandering the streets alone, and creeps can show up anywhere at any time. Something I would soon enough witness to be true. I hope they're heading home, I thought to myself. I then got to the playground attached to the middle school. The playground is on the corner of the block, with an alley leading to the parking lot behind the school, separating the playground from the local high-speed line going into the nearby city about 10 miles away. The high-speed line is built underground, with an open top and high walls topped off with a chain-link fence to keep pedestrians from falling in. There is a bridge to cross the tracks below, and then another street on the other side of the tracks from the school running parallel to the rails, with one way going into the downtown business district and the other way going into a residential neighborhood. The young girls turn on this street, going towards the neighborhood away from downtown. I did 1 set of pull-ups on the monkey bars and was resting when I noticed a white pickup truck with the headlights cut, and a raised cab with blacked-out windows covering the bed of the pickup truck, moving slowly past the middle school in the same direction of the girls moments before. I found this very suspicious, and even more so once the truck stopped directly in front of the playground, almost as though the driver/passenger was checking it out. I stared at the truck, wondering what was going on, when I noticed there was a man walking about 20 feet behind the truck in the same direction. As he passed the stopped truck, the window of the truck was rolled down and I could see there were 2 men in it. I clearly saw them look over and made a keep going forward hand signal to the driver/passenger, which followed his direction and started moving again, creeping slowly along with the headlights cut just as they were before. I watched as they crossed the tracks and saw the man on foot go right on the parallel road along the tracks towards downtown, while the truck went left on the same street towards the residential neighborhood in the same direction the young girls had gone no less than 3 minutes before. What the hell did I just witness, I thought to myself, as I tried to make sense of what I had just seen. To me, it seemed that the truck and man on foot were following the young girls, stopped at the playground to see if that's where they were going, and kept going when they only saw me doing pull-ups. I felt sick to my stomach. I tried to think of what else these men could have been up to, looking for a lost dog? No, they weren't calling out, and were driving much too slowly. Doing a deal? Maybe. But what kind of deal goes down in a fairly well-lit school area? Also, the man on foot signaling the truck forwards, and then going the opposite way down the next cross street did not make any sense. In my head, I thought at best what I saw was some kind of deal, and at worst was 2 predators. I decided to follow the man on foot to find out. I followed him as he walked along the wall separating the sidewalk from the tracks below. On the other side of the street was a church and some office buildings. He was slowly walking and texting someone on his phone. I turned around and saw the truck had stopped again about 2 blocks up the road in the opposite direction. The man on foot then completely stopped as I approached him. I couldn't be sure as to whether he realized I was pursuing him, so I approached him in the most casual way possible. The man looked to be in his early 30s, stood to about 5'10", with a slouch, had curly hair with a noticeable scar going down the side of his head through his hair. From the moment I began to speak, this man, I could tell, was very nervous. The way he acted and spoke with me made me even more suspicious up until the conclusion of our conversation. Admittedly, my adrenaline was going, so I don't remember how the conversation went word for word, but this is pretty much it. "Hey man, what's up? What are you doing?" Not much. Just hanging out." "Just hanging out, huh? Where you going?" "Just on a walk." "I saw you signaling to that sketchy truck back at the playground. That was kind of weird. What's up with that?" "Nothing at all. I just waved at them as I walked by." "You didn't just wave at them. I saw you make a hand signal for them to keep going." I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know them." "I'm not stupid. I clearly saw you signal them. I know you know them. Just tell me what you're really doing out here, because it's very suspicious." The creep at this point then nervously starts walking away from me. "I'm not up to anything." I put my hand on the man's shoulder to stop him. "No, stop. Tell me what you're doing right now. You're acting very sketchy, and it's making me nervous. I know you're up to something, so tell me the truth. I don't care if you're doing a deal or whatever." "I'm not doing anything. I swear I'm a good Christian man. I swear." Then he points to a church behind me across the street, and me, as suspicious as ever, replies, "I didn't ask your religion, what you were, or whether you're a good person or not. I asked what you're doing with that sketchy truck. Now, do you want to tell me, or should I call the police and have them come ask you?" "You can call the police. I'm not up to anything. Leave me alone. I'm scared." The man then turned to start walking away, faster this time. I admit I was quite angry at this point, and I knew I was clearly being lied to, and this guy was definitely up to no good. I push him very hard with one arm to get him to stop. The dude loses his balance and almost falls over, but then immediately starts sprinting away from me down the street, turns the corner, and then continues to sprint into the downtown business district, passing right past a few other pedestrians on the street. There was no reason for me to chase him, so I lost sight of him as he ran away. I looked back at the truck down the road that was stopped at the beginning of the confrontation, and it was gone. I then take out my cell phone and call the non-emergency police line to report everything. The police thanked me and sent a patrol car to the area by the middle school. When I told my girlfriend about what happened, she was very upset with me for following and confronting the man. However, after what I saw, I'm still convinced that I witnessed 3 men stalking 2 underage girls, possibly with intent. I could not come up with any other explanation as to what could have possibly been going on. Seeing how nervous the man was talking to me, paired with how he lied and then took off running, only further convinced me of what I saw. I followed my gun instinct and took action. I would do it all again. However, I would have called the police before confronting the man myself if I could redo the whole thing. My girlfriend's concern was for my safety, although I was much bigger than the man and made sure he was at least at arm's length at me at all times. He could have been armed, so I understand her concern. At the very least, I hope I thwarted a possible crime. And for the creep that ran away, let's not meet again. Our little village was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and I could count the amount of houses on 2 hands. We were a really quiet and close-knit community, and nothing ever happened there. Proper out in the sticks stuff. One night a few years ago, my mom and my stepdad had gone out to this concert and left me in charge of my little brother and the dog. I wasn't very old, about 14, and I felt really proud that my parents trusted me enough to do that. I thought I was a pretty cool big brother, and I thought we'd be doing cool babysitter stuff like staying up late and eating pizza. I'm kind of glad we did, because I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't. At about 10:30 the power cut out. I didn't think anything of it, because the weather hadn't been great lately, and I figured that had something to do with it. I got some candles out the cupboard and lit them, and put some of our favorite songs on. As soon as I sat down, Sonny, my little brother, turned to me, and being the weird little kid he was, told me very calmly that someone was outside. I was a little perturbed by him, but the dog hadn't done anything, so I presumed it was just the neighbors or something. He just shrugged and went back to his drawings. There's a running joke in our house that you don't need a clock with the dog around, because he's such a creature of habit that he will constantly get up at the exact same time every night to tell you it's time to initiate his nightly go-to-bed protocol. It was about 3/4 of an hour after the power went out when my dog decided that now was the time. I told Sonny to go get the dog his biscuit while I let him out for a wee. Now, our kitchen is an extension to the original house, and so, as such, has a flat roof that's comparatively low to the ground compared to the rest of the houses, and offers easy access to the bathroom window. As I opened the door so the dog could do his thing, Sonny pushes past me in the doorway and whispers, "I know you're out here, and I'm calling the police." As he turned around with the biggest, proudest smile you've ever seen on his face, there was a very distinct rustling coming from just above the doorway. I don't think I'll ever forget the way Sonny's face dropped when he looked just above my head. I looked up. The man was sitting on the roof above me, panicked, tried to kick me, and then ran off into next door's garden, and presumably into the cornfield surrounding our village. I was beyond terrified, and Sonny was crying his eyes out. I ushered him inside as quickly as I could, and retrieved a pointy metal object from the kitchen. We both went back to his room, and I told him to try to get some sleep while I waited for our parents to come back. It was an agonizingly long 4 hours before they did. My stepdad immediately went outside to check to see if everything was all right. I heard them talking about how something had smashed the fuse box. Obviously, we called the police, but they didn't come until later that day. They did a search of the immediate premises and found a makeshift bed in a nearby disused barn, along with pictures of silhouettes of us in the shower through the frosted glass. I think it's pretty safe to say the whole experience definitely shook us up. We moved out there as soon as we could. but I still shut curtains whenever I can, and I see shadows underneath every door I see. Sonny keeps quiet about it, but I'm not sure if that's just because his brain has cut it out or what. I'm 28 years old, but when I was about 5, my mum and I lived in this duplex that was off a main road and kind of in a wooded area. We lived on one side and on the other was a woman and her son. He was studying to be a teacher. My mother had me young, so she was about 25 and the guy was in his early 20s. He would often come over to talk to my mum. My mother said he would ask a lot of questions about me and ask my mother if it would be alright for him to take me for walks in the woods. My mother always declined. My mother worked in the operating room at the local hospital and was on call a lot, so most weekends I stayed at my grandma's house. One night while I was at my grandma's house, my mum was at home alone, sleeping. She awoke in the middle of the night and said she doesn't remember if she heard something or felt someone in the room, but she woke up. She could see feet wearing socks sticking out from the end of her bed. She grabbed her bedside lamp and was about to hit the intruder when our neighbor yelled her name and said his name. He couldn't explain why he was in her bed, naked and only wearing socks, but he begged my mother to not tell his mother about it. My mother, of course, called the police. She ended up going to court and making a victim impact statement against this guy, because she was terrified he'd become a teacher and be around children. She says she's pretty sure he was there for me that night, and I'm so happy I wasn't. We ended up moving immediately because she couldn't stay another night in that house. My old house was pretty pumped up on security. We had finger IDs, passcodes on doors and cameras everywhere. An automatic security system that could call the police or play fake, the cops have been called, blah blah blah. This story happened a few years back. My dad noticed a weird looking man, pretty covered up, lurking on the streets just outside our house. We thought nothing of it, since sometimes you get the occasional drunk or high person wandering around. But this man started to inch closer and closer to our house, first being on the opposite side of our street, then before we knew it being basically on our property. We just sort of watched him to see what he would do. I'm pretty sure we got bored and walked away and just forgot. Then we started to hear strange noises coming from downstairs, where our front door was. We decided to switch on the camera, and sure enough, this guy is banging on our door trying to get in. Then he looks through the window. He gives up and then starts to go around the side. There was a set of stairs that led to the upper area where we were, and he starts to head up, which sent my dad to go to the side of the house, where he was with a weapon, and scream at him. This guy runs and we don't see him again. That was the end though, right? Wrong. He comes back again. I guess he saw that the car was gone from the driveway, as my dad had to go get something leaving me and my mum, and he looks around. We didn't want to confront this guy, so we had an idea of playing the fake cop alert that could be heard outside. So we played it, and as soon as the guy heard it, he ran. Never saw him again after that. What makes this story creepier is on the news later it showed a guy who lurked around houses and then elected to end their lives. He'd been arrested, and it was the same man who was at our house. This first started when I first moved into my new place, last summer in 2019. I live with my landlord, her elderly mum, and my friend Daisy. I also started a new job working night shifts at a hotel, so I was up most nights. I'm going to preface this story with some background info that will help everything make sense. Since my landlord knew her neighbors very well, as she lived in this house all her life and there is hardly any street parking, I was able to park in the vacant house's driveway, directly parallel across the street from ours. When I park my car, I can see the front of my place with my rearview mirrors. Our house is right in front of a very busy stop sign, so seeing/hearing traffic is something we all have to get used to. Daisy and I identify as women and are best friends that met in college. We've known each other for a few years at this point and did everything together. I remember it was a warm summer Thursday night. Daisy and I loved to leave the house past midnight, eat terrible fast food, roll the windows down and drive along the coast. It was around 1:45 a.m. as I finally pulled up to my parking spot. We sat in the car for a while, listening to music and finishing the last bit of our late night munchies. My windows were up by this time, but we could hear a bigger car like a diesel approaching the stop sign. Of course, it was a stereotypical white van that prompted me to joke, "Daisy, look at that creepy white van." From my rearview mirror, the next thing we knew, we saw what looked like a thin man pick up his camera from the passenger side and took at least 5 pictures of the front of our house with the flash on. Daisy and I silently looked at each other in horror as the van sped off. The next day, Daisy and I told our landlord about the incident and told us this was not the first time one of her tenants reported this. Though she brushed it off despite us telling her that anyone taking pictures of her house late at night did not have good intentions, it really put me and Daisy on edge. Some time has passed as the coronavirus pandemic crept its way into the US towards the end of 2019. I was going to file a police report as I eventually caught most of the person's license plate after what felt like months of investigating. At the beginning of February 2020, the van stopped coming, which caused me to think the pandemic either may have gotten the person sick or affected them in some way. Although the person didn't take any more pictures as far as I saw, when the van drove by, it came from the same direction every time, around 1 to 1:30. It would stop for an eerily long amount of time and then would speed off out of nowhere, as if the person were racing another car that was never there. I did stop investigating after 2 weeks of nothing. I still get very anxious if I hear a loud, diesel-like vehicle drive by late at night. I don't know what the person wanted or why they were taking pictures of my landlord's house. Maybe once quarantine is lifted, I might investigate again to ensure that the creep comes no more for his late night visits. My name is Starla. I was born and raised in Toledo, Ohio. I'm married and have 1 child from a previous relationship. My husband is on dialysis due to kidney failure. He does it at home now, but the story I'd like to share with you took place at a time when he was actually getting his dialysis treatment at a center. One day I was home alone, just writing music and listening to free instrumental vibes via YouTube. My son was with his father at the time, and I thought I heard a knock on my door. So I turned down the music and listened for about 3 to 5 minutes, and I heard nothing. I thought perhaps my ears were playing tricks on me, since I'm known to be a very paranoid person. I then turned the music back up and heard a knock on the door again. This time my mind wasn't playing tricks on me, so I slowly crept down to the door and looked through the peephole, and then I saw him. Someone squatting. I'm assuming waiting for me to open the door. I then backed away and heard a voice say, "I know you're in there. Let me in, or I'll break in." I yelled and told them to leave me alone. I didn't know who they were or what they wanted, but I would be calling the police, and what he said next made my skin crawl. "The police won't be able to save you, because I'm good at keeping up with time and hiding the deceased." In other words, the police wouldn't arrive on time. Then he said, "If this door isn't open by the time I count to 5, I'm breaking in." After he counted, he started to kick in my door. I ran to my bedroom and locked it and phoned the police. As I was locked in my bedroom, I heard him rambling through things and saying how he was going to find me, so come out, wherever I was hiding. He then came to my bedroom door, started turning the doorknob, and I was sweating grease in a skillet while he was trying to open it. But that didn't last too long, because about 10 minutes after, They caught him and arrested him right then and there and made me go downtown to file a report. When I went to court to testify and rest my case, the judge told me I was lucky that I got away, and I asked, why? Apparently the man that broke into my house was actually wanted for breaking into another person's home that he had been stalking for quite some time, and ended her life, an elderly lady. I feel bad for whoever the lady was, but don't get me wrong, I'm happy and relieved that I was one of the ones who made it out alive. I told my husband all about it, and he was more angry than anything. We soon moved out of that place where this event happened, and have never had to experience anything like that again. When I was about 6 years old, my mum officially ended her on and off relationship with my father, and we moved into a small but cozy one-room apartment. I had my own room while my mum would sleep on a bed couch, as she preferred to fall asleep with the TV. We were on the 3rd floor, and the first door on that floor. We only had one neighbor. When we first moved in, I was in school and my mum was unpacking at home. After she dropped me off, she met our neighbor who lived next door. She introduced herself as his new neighbor, but he looked very resentful for some reason, as if my mum did something bad. After the introduction, he asked, "So you're the new neighbor?" Which was weird because my mum had just introduced herself as such, but regardless of that weird question, she said yes, and that she lived here now with her daughter, me. "My girlfriend was supposed to move in here, but then she couldn't because you got the place first," he said to my mum grumpily. My mum was confused but apologized for his inconvenience, and that was the first weird encounter with the neighbor. After we had lived here for some months already, he suddenly became very friendly. Before, we would only meet him on the floor sometimes, but he rarely left his house anyway, so we basically never saw or interacted with him. Then suddenly, one day, my mum was coming home from work with me after picking me up from school, and he was standing at his door drinking coffee. "Hello, Mary. I have made coffee. Would you like to have some and come inside?" My mum politely declined. She looked a bit frightened. He was a very tall man, and I think the sudden change in his behavior since the last conversation must have creeped her out a little bit. We went inside and I asked what that was all about. She told me she believed that he might have a mental illness, and I agreed that this could be plausible, so we left it at that. Some days went by and nothing happened with the neighbor. We wouldn't actually see him at all in the days that he wasn't communicating with us. Some nights later, I woke up from playing Hit Me Baby One More Time by Britney Spears very loudly, because I was around 6 or 7. I was thinking it must be the 4 a.m.ish music videos on TV on some channel from my mum's living room, that I just left it on, since my mum didn't seem to hear it or complain and fell back asleep. The next day, I asked my mum about the music, and she said she had turned off the TV after she dozed off, and it wasn't her, and told me she didn't hear anything. So I just assumed I imagined it. Some days later, I awoke to the sound of music once again. This time I was sure I was awake and heard it. I went to the living room to wake my mum up and noticed that you couldn't hear it from the living room. I woke my mum to show her the noise and she clearly heard it too. She wandered around my room to see which direction the sound was coming from, until she put her ear up against the wall, facing the neighbors. After listening for a few minutes, she confirmed to me it was coming from this side, and that it was the neighbor, as we didn't have other neighbors. She called the police and complained to them about the music, and that it woke me up, and she had a child that needed to go to school the next day and was losing sleep. The police arrived 30 minutes later, and we stood in front of our closed door to listen to the conversation between our neighbor and the police. They told him a neighbor complained, and that he needed to turn down the music as it was already way past midnight. He was very blunt and avoided any further talk with the police, just saying okay all the time. After we heard the police leave and his door close, we went to bed. Immediately the next day, he was standing in front of his door at my mum's when she was coming from work home alone. He asked her something along the lines of, "Did you call the police on me?" My mum, a single mother living next to a tall man who gave off weird vibes, lied and denied the allegations. He asked her if she liked the music, and my mother told me it left her speechless. She said she didn't like Britney Spears. My mum was always the Bon Jovi kind of woman, and this still amuses me to this day. And quickly left to go into her own apartment. As it was Friday that they had the encounter, she would stay in most of the weekend, being safe from the weirdo. But I wasn't there, so I didn't know what creepy things she might have noticed on the weekend. On Sunday, I came back from my dad's in the later evening. After dinner, I would go to bed as I had school the next day. Again, I woke up at night because of the same Britney Spears album. This time it was Toxic. I woke up my mum again and she came into my room banging against the wall, revealing in that moment by doing that it was her that had called the police the other day. We heard the music being turned down lower, but not turned off, and the neighbor screamed through the wall, "Do you like that song, Mary?" and then turning the music back up. My mum, understandably creeped out, called the police again, but before they could arrive, he turned off the music and the police couldn't do anything, as he turned the music off about 20 minutes already before they arrived. I guess he heard my mum say that she was going to call the police again, and I didn't sleep well that night, and my mum didn't sleep at all. A few things happened since then that were rather unsettling. For example, we could sometimes hear him literally listening into our conversations. My mum's phone calls of when my mum had guests over, we could hear him moving rooms to the same direction as we did, and him walking against the wall and then stop walking, indicating he was listening. Really creepy stuff, but my mum had no solid proof to call the police against him. One day, we would walk our dog, a female golden retriever, and he would watch us from his window. When my mum noticed that for the first time, she looked out for it the next time, and he was watching us from the window again. At this point, if not earlier, my mum had told my uncle about the neighbor, who would then show up once to knock on his door with the intention to tell him to leave us alone, but he didn't open the door to him. He was very clearly home, and we could see him move inside. My uncle screamed through his door. We hoped he would get scared off a bit by him, but he didn't. At that point, my mum didn't leave me alone anymore, not even in the apartment. I had to come here with her wherever she went. Once we were walking the dog again, and he happened to come down the stairs at the same time. He would stop and say, "Oh, she's a cute dog." But how did he know she was female? My mum became so frightened. She didn't even reply, but acted like we had forgotten something in the apartment, and we went back inside, as we didn't want to be outside when he seemingly was as well. It was clear he was listening to everything we said through the walls, to the point he even knew our dog was female. Some time went by, and we would just notice his usual creepy behavior of watching us from the window, listening through the walls, and the occasional Britney Spears music at night. Suddenly we were coming back from the grocery store, and there happened to be a piece of paper trapped on his door. We looked at it, and it was a phone number. Without saying anything to me, my mum just looked at me briefly, took the paper, and we went inside our home. We looked at the paper and noticed he wrote it on the back of a recent grocery receipt, where he apparently had bought tons of cheese and bread, which was very strange. She told me she was going to ring the number anonymously, and I should record it with my emergency cell phone. She started calling the number anonymously. I began recording, and the neighbor immediately picked up. Looking back, I guess he saw us taking the note through the peephole. He furiously started shouting into the phone, "Mary, It's 4:56, you should have called." He kept only saying this on the phone. We could even hear it through the wall. He repeated this, then laid down the phone, walked around his room as we could hear him because his voice was becoming more and more distant, but kept saying the same thing. My mum called for 1 minute, then hung up. We were freaked out. I remember I was very scared and begged for my mum to stay somewhere else tonight. But my mum says, "No, this ends today." And it did. Hours later in the evening, something crazy happened. We didn't do anything. All my mum did was call my dad to let him know what was going on, and he was on high alert to come over any time. We suddenly heard a knock on the door, not a neighborly knock, it was a police knock. My mum jumped up, obviously cautious, walking to the door, looking through the peephole, and it was the neighbor. Before my mum could react, he knocked again. "Mary, what's wrong? You haven't walked the dog. Open the door." My mum answered the door. Asked him to go away, but he didn't. He kept talking through and knocking on the door. I got scared and asked my mum to call the police or my dad. The neighbor suddenly said, "Don't worry, Veronica. Don't be scared." I got 100% more scared, and so did my mum. She started screaming through the door to piss off and leave us alone. But he wouldn't. My mum, I don't know why, opened the door and told him loudly to leave us alone. Very seriously. I don't know what he said back really, but I don't really think it made much sense. As my mum was about to close the door on him again, he suddenly put his foot in between to try and force his way in. My mum pushed the door against his body and screamed for help while he still tried to get into the apartment. I freaked out and started crying. I grabbed the fishing net I had and hit the neighbor with the handle of the net. After what seemed like only 2 minutes, a neighbor from upstairs ran downstairs to our rescue, pulling the guy away from the door and holding him against the wall. My mum told me to go into the living room, but I stayed close so that I could see. Our upstairs neighbor was shouting at the creepy one to leave us alone, that we're a woman and child living there and he is a danger to us. The creep then quickly disappeared into his own apartment, and the good neighbor came to check up on us, telling us the guy had always given him weird vibes. In fact, mentally ill. And this apartment was given to him by governmental support. We thanked him for his help, and he informed us that he had called the police before, and they would be coming shortly, and he was waiting for the police to serve as witness. My mum called my dad for additional support, who almost arrived with the police at the same time. The police then knocked on his door, and after he asked who it was, the police told him someone had called them due to him harassing his neighbors. He opened and demanded to see their badges, which they showed, and my mum and I could look inside his apartment, and it seemed empty. He didn't have much furniture, and it seemed like he just moved in, with essential things missing like a fridge. The walls were dirty. He then said he didn't do anything, but the good neighbor told the police what happened. The creep then got asked for his ID. He said he didn't have any. The police didn't believe him and said if he couldn't provide ID, they would come back with a search warrant so they could help him find his ID. He came back a few minutes later with his ID. Then they quickly looked up his record and they confirmed that he was mentally ill, that it wasn't told to us, and that he had been stalking another person once before. Maybe his girlfriend who actually wanted our apartment, and that they can't make him move due to governmental protection, but they can talk to his mental health institute about his incident. And at the end of the talk, they really recommended my mum move, as they know law enforcement can be slow in these cases, as they didn't want to risk either mine or my mum's well-being. My dad was now coming round more often, due to this, for 2 months until we moved. We left the place to my cousin who moved in next, and my cousin who moved in, he met the neighbor who then asked him, "Where's Mary?" And my cousin told him that he will never see her again, and that he better not talk to him or his family ever again. I think that scared him off because shortly after he mysteriously moved from one day to another, and that was the end of that. So to the creepy neighbor who ruined Britney Spears for me, Let's never meet again. This happened about 15 years ago, but to this day I cannot live in a ground floor building. When I was 15, I was staying at my mum's house for the weekend. My parents are divorced, so it was just me and her. It was about 12:30 a.m. I was chilling in the living room watching TV while my mum was asleep. The living room had 2 windows that faced the front yard, and I often left the curtains open as the house was set back from the road. My mum's house was not in the best part of town, but I had always felt relatively safe there. While I was watching TV in my pajamas, I saw movement from the corner of my eye from the window that was closest to me. It was only about 4 feet away. I turned and looked out the window, and a man's face was staring right back at me, smiling the most hideous grin I'd ever seen. I was frozen, and for about 20 seconds I was just sitting there with my eyes locked on his. Suddenly my panic set in, and I leapt up from the sofa and tried to run to my room. I slammed my leg right above my knee into the wooden coffee table and fell to the ground, my leg feeling like it was jelly. I scrambled up and shouted for my mum. My mum came running in half asleep, wondering what was wrong. I started stammering that someone was in the window watching me, and just as my mum was starting to realize what I was saying, we both heard someone attempt to open the front door to the house. Me and my mum both stood still, thinking that it was double locked. But then, when it stopped, my mother looked horribly grave and just whispered, "The back door." She turned and bolted through the house, and scrambling turned the deadbolt on the back door in the kitchen and backed away. She then ran to her room and pulled a baseball bat from beneath her bed. That I knew she kept there because she was a woman living alone. Frantically, she asked me to call the police, which I did, whispering to the operator that someone was trying to get into the house. We then saw a shadow approach the back door quickly and desperately tried to open the door, kicking and grunting while they tried to get in. My mum shouted, "I have a bat and will end you if you try to get into this house. The police are on their way." The person on the other side stopped and was still for about 30 seconds before turning and running away. My mum and I stood in the middle of the kitchen for 20 minutes. That's how long it took the police to get there. The whole time my mother had the bat raised and was ready to strike. When the police finally came, they looked around the house. They found that the flowers outside the window were trampled, and there were several cigarette butts on the ground outside the window where I saw the man. No one in my house smokes, and the police assumed it must have been there for a while. They didn't find him and took my description, but we never heard anything more about it. My mum moved away from that house a year later, even though we never had another incident. I now live in another country with my husband, who wonders why I have no idea to own a house and love living in high-rise apartments. I also pay for state-of-the-art home security and have a baseball bat in my closet, just like Mum. I have no idea what would have happened if my mother had not realized the back door was unlocked and had beaten the man to it, or if for some reason my mother wasn't there that night as she worked late. I don't know if the man thought he could overpower 2 women alone, or if he was just trying to scare us. Whatever that man had intended, I pray he didn't find someone else who forgot to lock their back door. I got my first job at 15, working in the local convenience store for under-the-table paychecks until I turned 16 so they could legally hire me. They needed staff they could underpay, and I needed money to support my family. Plus, the store was literally 10 minutes from my house, so I could go home for lunch or go jogging in the field next to the store. I'm a very friendly person and loved to make conversation because it helped the day go by faster. One morning, a guy in his late 20s to early 30s came into the store to receive a click-and-collect package, and the system was being really slow, so I asked him about his previous evening. It had been Guy Fawkes night, so it was my topic of conversation with everyone that day. He didn't appear to want to talk much, and so I overcompensated with my own talking. So there wasn't any awkward silence while the parcels were scanning, and I told him about how my dog hates fireworks, so I stayed inside with him. He then asked me when the store closes, which so many people at my store do, that I didn't find this information weird. I told him it was going to close at 3 p.m. because it's Sunday. He left with his parcels, and I literally didn't think of him at all again. I took my break at midday and went on my usual laps around the field after getting rid of my work uniform, and as it was fairly cold, no one else was on the field. I'm on the opposite side and I look to my left, because I'm dramatically singing along to Hamilton with my headphones in, and there's some guy sitting alone on the children's swing set in the park. Because it's pretty cold, and I'm embarrassed by feeling watched, I finished my jog there and finished my break inside the stockroom drinking tea. Again, this didn't faze me, because there are always weirdos hanging around my area, and many of them I know because of how close the community is. I finished my shift at 4 after cleaning and restocking for the next day, and was let out through the back exit car park that was shared with a dilapidated pub. Funnily enough, that one I have many childhood memories of before it closed down, because my parents and I have lived on this estate our entire lives. Some guy was sitting on the wall there with his coat hood pulled up. This was slightly strange, because nothing around the area was open, and hadn't been for at least an hour, especially not the pub. But I was 15, and I'd taken the same walk down the main road every single shift without issue. I put my headphones in with a slight pinch of anxiety, because as soon as I moved past this guy, I saw him jump up from the wall from the corner of my eye. I don't put music on, I just listen to his footsteps follow me, until he's next to me, and gesturing for me to remove my headphones. As you probably guessed, it's the same guy from the morning shift. I'm quite confused at this point, because it's the first time I'd seen him in my local store. We have a lot of regulars, and I would even know most of them by address because we saved everyone's newspaper, but I'd never seen him before, only encountered him twice in one day. I removed my headphones and asked what he wanted. He asked me for the time, and I assumed, because we live on a council estate, that perhaps he was going to mug me. It's happened before. I told him 4 p.m. without taking my phone out. Then he proceeds to pretend he only just recognized me from the store and tells me he thought I finished at 3. I've watched enough true crime to be guessing he'd waited for me to finish my shift for an hour. I was having a mild panic attack at this point because it was a lazy cold Sunday, so nobody was around, and I wasn't yet at the main road. So I continued to talk with him while he questioned me about how long I'd worked there at the store. I know it's stupid to engage, but he was keeping my pace right next to me, and the main road was only down the street where I thought our paths would diverge. He asked me if I worked there all the time, and in an effort to dissuade him from trying to hit on me, I told him I was still studying, although I would not tell him at which institution. My being a minor didn't seem to quite deter him. Mind you, at the age I am now, being 20, I just look about 15. Like I said, he was undeterred and tried asking for my number, in which I told him I didn't have a phone, an obvious lie because my headphones were plugged into them, and I was tightly gripping my pocket. He brought this up, and I told him that I shared a phone, but I didn't have my own. Despite this being an obvious lie, he continued. I was on the main road now, but he had not stopped talking, and my quickest way home, the path I usually took, was through a dark wooded area and then a shady parking lot. I opted for the longer way to keep myself on public roads so he wouldn't know where my house was located. He asked for my Facebook, and I desperately wanted to get away from him at this point, so I thought if I gave him my Facebook and then changed my name, as soon as I had the chance, he would be unable to find me. I don't know why I just didn't give him a fake name. I was young and stupid and honestly was just scared that no cars had passed yet and he was still tailing me. After this, I asked him which way he lived, and he told me only a short while up ahead and asked me if I was interested in coming along with him. I said I live in this other direction and would say goodbye now, but that we could speak again later. I know I'm an idiot, but I thought if he thought I was interested in speaking to him, he would leave me alone. And because of my experience in talking to people in this job, this came off very casually and truthfully. It worked. I crossed the road, and as soon as I was out of sight, I legged it back down to the other side of the road and got home. When home, I went to change my name but found he had already messaged me. Although I had not told him my middle name, that was a part of my Facebook, which he brought up to me in his first message. I messaged him back explaining I had no interest in him and instantly blocked his account. I felt so stupid for even letting him have my real name that I couldn't bring myself to tell my parents. Instead, I asked my brother to meet me at the store at the end of my shifts. It was only Sundays. I finished an hour late because I wanted them to help me pick out ingredients for dinner that night. My first shift back, he was waiting outside in the same area, but my brother was with me, and we went around the front way so I could see him waiting there, but didn't have to walk past him. After this, I decided I couldn't keep getting escorts home, and told my work I needed to leave at different times in case he followed me. They wanted to tell authorities, but I refused because it was a relatively small thing and I was working illegally there and didn't want to get them in trouble. I told my parents, and they told a few people in the neighborhood to be wary. I started getting the bus home from school because I was worried he had my Facebook and now knew where I went to school. The next time I saw him, he came into the store again to collect parcels. I told my manager next to me, and she served him while also telling him they could call someone if he continued to harass me. I was scared about all the information he now had from my Facebook, because I was a young kid, and my privacy settings were crap, and held my country, my school, hundreds of my pictures with friends in my neighborhood, at the school I was going to, and all of them were tagged. Fortunately, nothing more happened after this. I saw him once on the bus with my mother a year later, and this was while I was in college and at a shopping center. I'd quit my job a little while after this to work elsewhere legally when I turned 16 to earn more money, and I live in a different city now. He doesn't scare me anymore, but I definitely am way more private about my life on social media. Everything is on private, and I don't provide my real information for certain sites. This was a little story about my experience having a minor stalker. Obviously, I still blame myself for being dumb and having all my private information out there, but I still thought it would be an interesting thing to share. I was watching my daughter's kids while she and her husband were out of town. They have a teenage daughter called Alyssa. It was 3 a.m. and I woke up by a weird rustling sound. I looked out the window and see movement. I saw a boy emerge from the bushes on the other side of the house. I saw a bike tossed on the lawn that definitely wasn't ours. My first thought was that it was a burglar casing houses, but since he looked young and came on a bike, I figured scaring him straight would be enough for him to decide to head home. I didn't want to ruin a teenager's life by calling the cops straight away. So I went out to the porch, flipped on the light and said, "Can I help you?" in my classroom voice. The guy looked surprised but not nervous. He was wearing a Letterman-style jacket, but once I got a clear view of him in the streetlights, he seemed much older than my granddaughter, gruff and more wiry and athletic. He walked up close to the house and said, "Yeah, I'm looking for Alyssa." I gave him a disapproving glare, hoping he'd realize that he came looking for a girl late at night, and a grumpy old person answered, "It's time to split." I'm thinking what must have happened is Alyssa knew her parents were going out of town, and maybe before she knew I'd be staying over, told a secret older boyfriend to come. It was late at night and I was alone with several kids, so I didn't want him coming any closer to the house. I also thought it was weird he came so late, and wanted to be sure Alyssa actually wanted to talk to him. So I said, "I'm sorry, who?" And he said, "Alyssa, you know, Alyssa Elderman. This is her house." I thought he knew her full name. They must at least be friends. I said, "You wait there." He began to walk up and I felt a sick burning in my gut. Instinct kicked in and I yelled, "No, stop, freeze." Then readjusted and said, "You stay right there. This is private property and don't take a step closer. Wait there." So I go in and Alyssa is asleep just one room over from where the rustling first occurred. And I wake her up and say something to the effect of, "I don't know what the big idea is to have friends over at this time of night, but can you tell them to go home?" She had no clue what I was talking about. I say, "There's a guy outside waiting for you." Confused, she gets up and goes to the window. She sees him and goes white as a sheet. "He asked for me?" "Yeah." "By name?" "Yeah." "Call the police. I've never seen him before in my life." I called 911 immediately, but as I was on the phone with them, Melissa started tugging at my arm. "He's coming up." I had younger kids in the house to think about, so I kept the door latched and pulled it just open enough for the latch and yelled, "I'm asking my husband, and none of us know of any Alyssa. Leave my property or I'm calling 911. He got angry and started yelling for her to come out. Thankfully, the police came pretty quickly, and when he heard the sirens, he grabbed the bike and ran off. I watched where he was running to, and he jumped into the passenger side of a car without headlights or front plates and sped off. The police followed in the same direction once I pointed them, but they didn't get him. They advised us to take all her social media details offline if she wasn't sure she didn't know this person, and said they had a couple of similar reports recently and were looking into it. I got a heavy-duty lock, and she slept in my room for the remainder of my visit. This all started about a year ago. I'm a 23-year-old female and I live on the second floor of an apartment complex and have lived there my entire life. The building is mostly comprised of families with young children and married couples. A lot of the families have lived here as long as my family has, so everyone knows each other pretty well. There is only one apartment unit that isn't occupied by a family, but rather by a pair of brothers who keep to themselves. One day, one of their sons, who's around my age, appeared out of the blue. He was strange off the bat. He would always wear a sweatshirt with the hood up and would run through the apartment complex to get to his own apartment. I'm not sure what his face looked like because he always had the hood over his face. He lived on the first floor on the back side of the complex and would often get to his place by jumping through the window. He basically did everything in his power to avoid any interaction. I didn't mind him because I never saw him due to my busy schedule. However, one day, he started sitting on the top staircase that leads to my apartment. This was strange because his apartment unit was on the other side of the complex, and on the first floor. I brushed it off at first, but it started happening every day. When I would come home from school, he was there. When my boyfriend at the time would drop me off at night, typically around 10:30 to 11, he would be there. Sometimes when I would leave and come home back hours later, he would still be in the exact same spot as if he hadn't moved for over 5 hours while I was gone. At this point, I told my parents and my boyfriend about it, and they became very vigilant. My boyfriend would park his car and walk me to the door every time he dropped me off. Once he saw my boyfriend, he stopped sitting on the staircase, and I thought it was over, but it wasn't. He started waiting for me at my bus stop. The bus I take home from school stops right across the street from my home, so it's a short walk. One day when I was getting off, I saw him waiting at the bus stop. Once he saw me get off, he followed me into the complex and sat on the staircase. He also started following me when I would walk my dog. At this point, my parents were upset. My mum started letting the neighbors know he was following me, and my neighbors started making sure he wasn't bothering me, or if I was alone they would start a conversation with me until I got to my door. One day, I got a friend request on Facebook from this guy. Mind you, I'd never spoken a word to him. How did he know my name, let alone find my Facebook? My mum tried talking to his father, but they never answered the door when my mum knocked on the door. So I'm thinking, it can't possibly get any worse, right? He seemed harmless, so I wasn't too worried, but I was wrong. One day when I returned from my boyfriend's house, my mum told me she had something to tell me, but she didn't want me to get upset. She proceeded to tell me that when she was walking towards the kitchen to get a glass of water, she saw something in the tree move. Our kitchen has a huge window that takes up most of the wall. In front of the wall there's a huge tree. If someone were to climb the tree, you could see into our apartment. Well, guess what? When my mum took a closer look, she realized my neighbor was sitting in that tree looking straight into it. My mum called my dad over, and when my neighbor saw my dad, he jumped off the tree. At that moment, I felt my peace stolen from me. We filed a police report, but when the police went looking for him, he was gone. It turns out there were snack wrappers and a blanket hidden in between the leaves of the trees. The police think that wasn't the first time he was up on J Tree. I couldn't help but wonder how many times he saw me walking around and I had no idea. It's been about 6 months, and I haven't seen him since. His father still lives in the complex, but there's no sight of him. The police haven't been able to find him, so I have no idea what happened to him, but I do hope we never meet again. A few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough to not feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though. It made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got off home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house I saw only what my headlights and front porch illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. It was odd as I'd never smelt that before around the house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just gotten off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I was pretty tired. Even though it wasn't even 7 yet, I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way home from night classes. I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before cell phones had light sensors that would dim the screen to the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a few seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I'd opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open, and I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the little attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I had just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out the bathroom. My feet were just barely inside the attic when my bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in the room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone was hiding it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try and stop them if they began to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was about from their knees down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away, and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by a scream of frustration. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. The man in the house ran back down the stairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture knocked over, and I stayed crouched in the attic. I'd left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing it. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly, and when I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over, I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise that I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police, and I waited in my room until I heard them call out for me downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, and all the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on the shelves were thrown across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened, and all of the boxes and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth. So they think he had been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking cigarettes when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should probably stay with family or friends that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next few hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I never saw anything. The next day I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed in the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up to the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing ever happened at the house though. I lived there for 3 more years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of bed, going into my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept up at it when I moved, except now I go into a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the first hall. I was in college when I had my first solo apartment. This guy across the hall would come over or invite me over, and we'd hang out a few times. However, I would not call him a friend. One night he asks me to loan him money. In addition to not wanting to loan him money, I don't really have any, so he proceeds to ask for a ride to see his girlfriend because she has some money for him, and I agree. We arrive at her apartment, and a small party is going on. When we walk into the party, everyone immediately shuts up and stares at us. He runs off to find his girlfriend, who I find out is his ex-girlfriend. It is awkward because I'm kind of this guy's friend by association, and I'm getting a lot of angry stares. He gets into an argument with her, and we are basically thrown out. He then asks if I can take him to another part of town. He owes another guy some money and needs to go talk to him. We proceed to an unfamiliar part of town, and he instructs me to park in a fairly isolated spot. He explains that he doesn't want the other guy to see my car because he might take it. He owes this guy money for gambling, as well as other things, and he is always behind on payments. I left him and spent the rest of the night in that apartment, avoiding him. I'm a 23-year-old female, and I grew up in a rural area in Ontario. It was the kind of place where you never lock the doors because you know everyone in town. The all-too-trusting small-town mentality stayed with me once I moved to a big city for university. I got an apartment in a student area with a college nearby and plenty of bars within walking distance. I lived with a guy friend, Rhodey, who was a few years older than me from the same small town. I would go to the bars with friends on the weekends and stumble home alone around 2 a.m. One night on my way home, my neighbor Kyle and I met in the hallway and both headed to our own places. He was also drunk and so good looking, and he said hello and invited me inside. I ended up staying with him the night. He was nice, it was a fun night, if not a little awkward. We didn't exchange numbers, and it didn't seem like we cared for anything to come of it, so I went home in the morning and that was that. Fast forward 2 days later. I was asleep in my bed, and my roommate was half asleep on the couch with the TV on. He heard a sound that might have been the door creaking, but he ignored it in his tired state. A few minutes later he opened his eyes to see a naked man standing in front of him, lifeless and staring into his eyes. It was Kyle. Rhodey tried to talk to him and asked him what he was doing there, but he didn't respond. Rhodey ran to my room and said, I think Kyle is here to see you." I followed him out into the living room and saw a completely naked Kyle staring at us, with the most serious and concentrated eyes I've ever seen. I tried to talk to him and ask him to leave, but once again he didn't respond. Instead, he went into our kitchen, opened the fridge, proceeded to take our butter out, and started smearing it all over his chest and face, saying nothing, and still with a completely serious look on his face. Brody and I ran to my bedroom to talk about what to do. While we were still in my room, Kyle walked down the dark hallway that led to us and stood in the dark right before the light of my room could reach him. All you could see was his silhouette, and he started whispering, "Hey, hi," repeatedly. Brody and I ended up calling the police and staying in my room until they came and took him back to his house. They said he must have been on something, but probably wasn't a threat. I agreed and didn't think he was a threat, but I didn't sleep well that night, knowing he was a very thin wall away from us in his apartment. Next story. We also forgot to lock our doors on another time. I was at work and Rhodey was at home. I got a message from him that said, "Please get home, someone's here and I think you must know them because I don't." I took an early lunch and came home to see what was going on. There was a man with greasy black hair so long it nearly reached his elbows, and he was pacing back and forth in our living room. Before I even got a chance to speak to him, I realized he wasn't mentally present. He would alternate between screaming at the top of his lungs like he was being ended, and then he would cry and say things like, "I can feel the pain and suffering of everyone in the world. I can hear the voices of the poor and tormented, begging for help." I would chime in and ask politely, "Do you know where you are? What's your address? Can I help you get home?" And then he would start to scream at us because this was his house and he wasn't leaving, and he wanted us to stop judging him. After 10 minutes of his rambles and pacing, he said his address to us, which was actually the neighboring apartment where Kyle lives. I knew Kyle had a roommate that I met, John, but apparently this was their third roommate. I went to his door and knocked, and thankfully the roommate John opened the door and came to retrieve Rambling Man. Later that night, John knocked on our door, and I saw it was him holding a bottle of wine. He wanted to thank us for handling the situation well and making sure he got home. Apparently the man had recently been in a mental hospital and left on his own accord, and walked into the wrong apartment. His parents came and got him, and he's now back in the hospital, safe and sound. We have some very odd neighbors. This happened about 2 years ago, and still scares me when I think about it. First, a little background. My name's Jesse and I live in the UK, and I'm from a smallish area, nothing fancy. I'm 18, and at the time of this story I was 16 and working at a family friend's pub collecting glasses. I'd worked from 7 till 11 at night and lived about a half an hour away to 45 minutes. To get home, I had to walk through a park. Now, this park has 3 entrances. 2 at the top and 1 at the bottom, which leads into the town/center and main shopping area. The top 2 lead to 2 different areas. One is a skate park and the other is literally right next to a comprehensive school in a big field. This school has a lot of bushes and trees in it and only has a few lights. The only lights are on the lampposts outside each entrance to the park, which are very dimly lit. Each entrance was a big gate, and they were always open. It's important to note this for later. I had to walk the path that leads towards the school, since it was the fastest way home. Now on to the story. I worked at the pub for a year, and had stuck to the same routine going home. I'd leave around 11, sometimes a few minutes before something, sometimes a few minutes before, sometimes a few minutes after. And it took about 10 minutes to get to the park, so I'd be walking through the park at around 11:30, give or take. Now the one entrance I had to use to get into the park was the one at the bottom, the one that leads to the shopping area. It had 1 lamppost outside the gate, and that was it. That was the only light, so I could see about 10 foot into the park, and there was a few benches. No one was ever in the park when I walked through it from work. During the autumn/winter weeks, it was always empty. Even the streets were. So you could imagine my shock when I saw a man sitting on the bench as I walked through the park gates. Now this was so strange. Around 1:15 to midnight, almost 12, it's pitch black and freezing, and this dude is just chilling on the bench. I couldn't see him too well at first, but as I got closer I got a good look at him. He was young, 20 to 25, long hair in a ponytail, but not a scruffy one. It was tight and neat. He had a hoop earring and his nose was pierced. I couldn't remember his eye color. He was so pale, with jet black hair with red tips, which went past his shoulders. He wore all black and dressed a bit like an emo. Looking back now, he reminds me and kind of looks like Dracula from the movie Van Helsing. He was on his phone and looked up at me as I walked towards him, and he just stared at me as I walked past. I gave him a slight courteous nod and smile and carried on going. He just looked me up and down with a smirk, which unsettled me. He didn't say anything and I managed to get home and didn't think much of it and forgot all about it. The next night I went to work. I finished my shift and walked through the park, and again, there he was. He was on his phone, wearing all black hair in a ponytail. He looked up to see me and smiled. I smiled back, but walked a bit faster past him. Again, he said nothing. This happened the next night, but on the 4th he wasn't there. I walked through the park as usual, but I felt so uneasy. It was pitch black, no lights except for the moon, and what do I hear? Footsteps, quick footsteps behind me. So I turn around and see nothing. I wasn't taking any chances though, so I ran through the park, and I swear over the sound of my heart beating fast and my footsteps, I could hear the sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching. After that, I started getting a lift home for about 2 weeks from a friend. Then, that friend went on vacation, so I had to start walking home through the park again. The first night, which was Monday, the man wasn't there, but I still felt uneasy, like I was being watched. And on the second he was, sitting on that same bench, smiling at me. But this time he spoke, in a very deep voice. "Hey baby, love the tights and skirt. Damn." I was wearing a black skirt and sheer tights, with thick black thigh high socks, and Doc Martens with a black biker jacket and a thick scarf. I had to wear all black for work, and I looked at him awkwardly, smiled and hurried away. The next few weeks, he'd be in the park and made lewd comments, and always sat on the bench. I'd try and get lifts home where I could, but there would always be times I'd need to go through the park. Lord, I hated that walk. One night, things escalated. I walked through the park as usual, and again he was there, sitting smiling at me. I did my best to ignore him, and he made comments about my body and what he wanted to do to me. As I was walking away, I was out of the light and could only see 2 to 3 feet in front of me. I must have been about 20 feet away when I hear running behind me and turn around. Someone runs at me at full speed and knocks me to the floor. I feel a heavy weight on me, and instantly I feel hair on my face and a hand over my mouth. A familiar deep voice in front of me tells me not to fight it, and that if I don't, it'll be over quicker. That's when his hands start to wander. I can hear his zipper, and that's when I know what's coming. He's mentioning how he's been waiting to do this for so long, and he took his hand off my mouth, and that's when I took my chance and bit him really hard. He screamed. He sat up, and I could barely see what I was doing, but I took that opportunity and pushed him off me and started to run, and heard him running after me. I got to the first gate that I usually leave by and was mortified to see it was locked. I could see it had a lock on it because the lamppost on the other side shone onto the usually open gate. I was so confused, but I could hear him shouting and started to run again, and I ran towards the other gate. It was closed, but not all the way. There was a small gap, and I just squeezed through it, leading to the skate park. He tried to grab me, and I turned and looked at him for a few seconds, catching my breath. He stared at me, and then started to try and fit through the gate, so I booked it as fast as I could. I ran towards the skate path park. The skate park was full of bushes on one side of the path that ran through it. It also had a long dark path which after about 20 minutes leads to a main road, but it's usually completely empty. I ran through the skate park and hid in the bushes waiting for him, since if I had run onto the path I'd be visible and he'd be able to see me and chase me, and since no one was around I'd stand no chance. The path that leads to the road had very few lights, but still had enough so he'd see me and be able to follow me. I sat in the bush, hiding, hand over my mouth. I sat there for a minute when I saw him running through the skate park looking for me. He slowed down near the exit path, which led to a long path, and he stood there for a minute just sniffing the air. No joke, he was sniffing it. His hair wasn't in a ponytail anymore. It was all over him. He wasn't wearing a coat. He wore a long-sleeved shirt that was all black. It was winter, which confused me since it was so damn cold. And he looked around, and I felt his eyes scan me. Then he kept looking and started walking down the long path. After about 10 minutes, I felt it was safe and ran back towards the park, and ran into the park and ran to the gate I usually go through to get home. It was still locked, so I just climbed over it. I walked towards the school following the path I always used to, and had a strange urge to look back. And there he was. At the gate, the man was just standing, just watching me. He laughed and said, "I'll catch you one day, baby girl, mark my words." He blew me a kiss and walked away into the darkness. I've never been so scared in all my life. I booked it home and told my mom what happened. She called the police and council and asked why the fence was locked. The council were just as confused as we were because the gate was never supposed to be locked, ever. The police couldn't do much. They put a warning out and that was about it. The creepy thing was he had to have learned my pattern. He had to have known I used the park every night to get home. It creeps me out to this day, knowing I was being watched and could have been assaulted or worse. I still have nightmares from time to time about him, and wonder what would have happened to me had I not gotten away, or had he seen me in the bushes. I stopped working at the pub and haven't used the park since. My friend and I were sleeping in my parents' room one night when she was over, and it was probably about 3 a.m. Suddenly we hear a sound like a fart from the corner of the room, and distinctly from this one corner. So I ask my friend if she farted, and of course she says no, as it clearly came from the corner. Thinking maybe it's my dogs, as they sometimes sleep in my parents' room. I go and check it out, but realize they're not in the room with us. Okay, so that's weird, I thought, and my friend also said she heard a distinct fart too, so we assumed that maybe we both misheard. Then all of a sudden an unknown caller starts ringing my phone, and I don't answer because at this point I'm freaked out. After I decline the call, I receive a message from an unknown caller with the same area code as the caller who just called me. The text message is all in Spanish, and me and my friend decide to paste it into Google Translate, where it proceeds to say, "Did you hear the fart?" Needless to say, we never slept in my parents' room again, and we are both convinced that we have a Spanish farting ghost in our presence. I'm a dog walker with Rover, and that means I go to strangers' homes every day, multiple times a day. As I walked up to this apartment that was facing the street, I saw a man peeking his head out from behind his door in apartment 1. We locked eyes, and he slowly retreated into his apartment. I got a weird feeling from him, but I had one more walk after this, so I brushed it off and headed to apartment 3. Apartment 3 is around the side of the building in a small alleyway that barely passes as a driveway for cars. There is a high privacy fence that runs along the alley. There's a stairwell that blocks the view to apartment 2 and 3. The apartment doors are side by side and set back in a way that makes them situated under the stairs. This client has 2 dogs, and I took one out at a time since her male dog is very aggressive. As I was returning with the female dog, Carly, I glimpsed the top of someone's head behind the stair. I got a weird feeling again, so I stopped. Carly nuzzed my leg and then stepped in front of me on high alert. A head peeked out from the stairs and I knew it was the man. I saw him see me and he hurried behind the stairs out of sight. I was pressed for time and knew that I needed to get the other dog to take him out. I approached the alleyway slowly. I pulled out my phone and was ready to dial someone for help. I had this feeling I should not turn in towards the client's door, so I walked a little past and turned to face Carly as if I was waiting for her. I could tell Carly was on edge. I followed her gaze and saw that the man was standing in front of apartment 2 with a beer bottle in his hand. He wasn't holding it like he was going to drink from it. He was holding it around the neck. He sees me and immediately presses himself back under the stairs. I gave him a questioning look, and he responds with a smile and gestures to apartment 3's door. I noped the hell out of there and decided to go behind the building and around the other side. As Carly and I rounded the building, back to the front, I made sure to hide so that if someone was in the alley they wouldn't see me. I wanted to see where that guy went. After a few minutes, I see the man slowly move away from the apartments and down the alley to where I had gone, beer bottle at the ready like a bat. I waited for him to round the corner, and Carly and I beelined it for the door. Thankfully, the rest of the walk went fine. Honestly though, it's probably because when I brought out the male dog, he decided to back off. This dog came out of the apartment barking aggressively on high alert. If I were this guy, I would have backed off too.